I might indeed begin by briefly explaining why I will be speaking not exclusively about John of the Cross. I've been very touched and very much appreciate the comments that some of you have made on reading the anthology. And I trust that even if I spoke only about one figure in there, you would nevertheless be glad that you read the whole book. Nevertheless, it seemed to me that having read excerpts from the writings of 25 Christian mystics, if at this conference you heard only from Father William about the author of The Cloud, and from me only about John of the Cross, you might say, well, what about all these other 23? Why did you have us read them? Now, obviously, I can't talk about all of these mystical writers in my 4 talks today, but John wasn't writing in a vacuum. He had his predecessors, he has his successors, and I do want to put him in that kind of context and treat at least 10 or so of the mystics in this anthology who could genuinely be called apophatic. Now, we have to admit that this very word apophatic is not in common parlance among our fellow Christians, but I think we should also be aware that it should be more common, and that ignorance of what the term stands for represents an impoverishment in the understanding of Christian spirituality. To avoid any possible confusion about what we're talking about, and even at the risk of repeating a bit of what Father William said the first day, let's begin with a brief definition of the word apophatic. I would actually approach it somewhat differently from Father William. It basically comes from a Greek verb meaning to deny, and so in our context, its meaning is really quite simple and straightforward. The denial that any of our concepts, ideas, or images are adequate for comprehending that ultimate mystery that we name God. This notion is so evident in Scripture and in the traditional teaching of the Church that if every genuine Christian were in any sense to be labeled, that person could be called apophatic, even if he or she had never heard the term. After all, the entire book of Job leads up to that majestic theophany which forces Job to admit, I have dealt with great things that I cannot understand, things too wonderful for me, which I cannot know. And the book of Isaiah includes those well-known verses, my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways, says the Lord. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so high are my ways above your ways, and my thoughts above your thoughts. It was against the background of this biblical doctrine that ecumenical councils of the Church have taught God's ultimate incomprehensibility. For example, toward the beginning of the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council said that between the Creator and the creature, no similarity can be expressed without noting a greater dissimilarity. And the First Vatican Council said that the Catholic Church believes and confesses that God is incomprehensible, infinite in intellect and will and every perfection, ineffably exalted above all things that are or that could be conceived beside him. Now, of course, this is only one side of the story. Indeed, if this were all, we'd be reduced to utter and absolute silence with regard to God. There is, in other words, also the so-called cataphatic way, according to which we do make certain affirmations about God which are true, even if incomplete and ultimately inadequate. No Christian thinker could possibly be exclusively apophatic or exclusively cataphatic. But we regularly use the term apophatic of those who emphasize the incomprehensibility of God. And this group includes some of the greatest theologians and mystics in the Church's history. It is their thought, their insights, and their experience which provide a foundation for the practice of centering prayer. Who then were these men and women, and what can we learn from them today? In this first talk, I will speak about three of them, and first, Gregory of Nyssa. This saint, whose feast will be celebrated on January 10th, at least in my Benedictine calendar, is sometimes called the founder of mystical theology, or the father of Christian mysticism. Like all the other early writers of the Christian East, and in this respect very unlike Augustine of Hippo in the West, Gregory does not tell us much about himself. It's all the more striking, therefore, when he occasionally alludes to a feeling of vertigo or dizziness that overcame him at times, similar to the dizziness one might feel when looking over an overhanging cliff down to the sea far below. I like to think that Gregory might once have had that very experience when walking along the coast of the Black Sea in his native Asia Minor. In any case, you'll recall from the anthology that this is the way he begins his beautiful sermon on the sixth beatitude, when he writes, "When from the sublime words of the Lord, resembling the summit of a mountain, I looked down into the ineffable depths of his thoughts, my mind had the dizzying experience of someone who gazes from a high ridge into the immense sea below." This mental or spiritual vertigo or dizziness to which he alludes was caused, in this instance, by an apparent contradiction in the Scriptures. For while Jesus, in that beatitude, says that the pure of heart will see God, numerous other passages in the Bible declare that no one has seen or can see God, or at least that no one can see the Lord and live. In grappling with this conundrum, Gregory clearly comes down on the apophatic side, for his overall conclusion is that the vision of God which Jesus promises to the pure of heart is not a direct vision, but rather a reflection of God's goodness in one's own heart, once that heart has been purified of all sin and unruly affections. Now this is altogether consistent with what Gregory writes elsewhere in his major mystical work, The Life of Moses. Like so many of the early fathers of the Church, Gregory was interested not only in the narrative sense of Scripture, that is, its account of what actually happened to Moses, for example, but also, and even primarily, in the spiritual sense, that is, the deeper meaning that the text holds for our own lives. And so, when in the book of Exodus, Moses is said to have climbed Mount Sinai and approached the heavy, dark cloud which enveloped the summit, this signifies that as one progresses in the Christian way of life, one will realize more and more clearly what of God's nature is totally beyond comprehension. In Gregory's own words, leaving behind everything that is observed, not only what sense comprehends, but also what the intelligence thinks it sees, the mind keeps on penetrating more deeply until it gains access to the invisible and the incomprehensible. And there it sees God. This is the true knowledge of what is sought. This is the seeing that consists in not seeing, because that which is sought transcends all knowledge. But if God, as Gregory says, is ultimately unknowable, that does not mean that God is inaccessible, but only that we gain access to God by another route, the way of love. Obviously, Gregory was far from the first to emphasize the primacy of love in Christianity. This is so evident already in the New Testament. But the way Gregory speaks about it, especially in his commentary or sermons on the Song of Songs, is unrivaled in its beauty. Like Origen of Alexandria before him, Gregory sees the love poetry of bride and bridegroom in the Song of Songs as a dialogue between the soul and Christ. Let us hear part of his commentary on chapter 5, verse 8 of the song, a verse that reads, "I adjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my lover, tell him that I am wounded with love." Gregory comments, "These wounds of love are beautiful. The noble lover of our soul shows his love, by which he dies for us sinners. And the bride, in turn, is inflamed with love, and shows the shaft of love placed deeply in her heart, for this represents fellowship with God. With her veil now removed, the bride sees with pure eyes the ineffable beauty of her spouse, and is wounded by a spiritual, fiery shaft of desire. For love which is aroused is called desire. There is no shame present, because this arrow is from God. But the bride boasts of her wound when she receives the pointed tip of spiritual desire in the depths of her heart. And she makes this known to her maidens, saying, I am wounded with love." That being wounded with this ardent love for God is compatible with our sense of God's incomprehensibility is something that I think could be clarified through the parallel case of human love. I remember once reading of a couple who were celebrating their golden wedding anniversary and who were very deeply bound to each other in married love. The husband commented that one of the greatest joys in their life together was precisely his inability to predict exactly what his wife would do or say in any particular circumstance. But now, he didn't mean that she was flighty or unstable, but simply that there was an impenetrable mystery in the depths of her being, a mystery that continued to attract and fascinate him all through their years together. And if you think carefully about it, you'll have to admit you are even a mystery to yourself. There are aspects of your being and personhood which you do not and cannot fully understand. How much more true must that be then in our attempts to understand God? Gregory knew this well and expressed it with unparalleled power, as when he writes in his Life of Moses, "Hope always draws the soul from the beauty which is seen to what is beyond. It always kindles the desire for the hidden through what is constantly perceived. This truly is the vision of God, never to be satisfied in the desire to see him. But one must always, by looking at what he can see, rekindle his desire to see ever more." It's surely an instinctive awareness of the impenetrable depths of God's mystery that draws you and so many other people to those imageless ways of praying, of which centering prayer is a prime example. And so in someone like Gregory of Nyssa, you have a wonderful theological resource. As I think you know, his Life of Moses is included in the Paulist series, The Classics of Western Spirituality. The St. Vladimir Seminary Press has published an excellent anthology of Gregory's mystical writings under the title From Glory to Glory, and Hellenic College Press has made available all 13 of his sermons on the Song of Songs. I think many of you would surely find much spiritual nourishment in one or another of those works. And I turn next to look at a writer who was definitely influenced by Gregory of Nyssa, and who may well have had an even greater influence than Gregory on later writers. And this despite the fact that we know so little about him, not even his real name. I'm referring, of course, to that Dionysius of whom Father William already spoke the other day, often called Pseudo-Dionysius because it's been determined in recent centuries that he was probably a monk, perhaps Syrian, of the late 5th and early 6th century, not the Dionysius mentioned by St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, whom this author purports to be. We have at our disposal also only about half of the treatises he claims to have written, namely the Celestial Hierarchy, the Ecclesiastical Hierarchy, the Divine Names, and the Mystical Theology. But even these four have earned Dionysius a secure place in the history of Christian spirituality. While his Mystical Theology treatise is perhaps the most thoroughgoing work of apophatic mysticism ever written, parts of his other treatises are clearly cataphatic. For example, in the Divine Names, he discusses a multitude of the names applied to God in Scripture and explores all the ways in which they can enlighten us about divine reality. But, and you'll recall this, I think, from the anthology, towards the end of that treatise, he states with all possible clarity the final inadequacy of any or all of these names. In his own words, no unity or trinity, no number or oneness, no fruitfulness, in need, nothing that is known or can be known can proclaim that hiddenness of the transcendent Godhead that transcends every being. There is no name for it, no expression. We cannot follow it into its inaccessible dwelling place so far above us. We cannot even call it by the name of goodness. In our urge to find some notion and some language appropriate to that ineffable nature, we reserve for it first the name which is first revered, the name One. Here he says, I am in agreement with the Scripture writers, but the real truth of these matters is in fact far beyond us. And you'll recall also from having read the Mystical Theology, a treatise so short that we were able to include all of it in the anthology, that Dionysius goes on in that work to write about what he calls the brilliant darkness of a hidden silence in terms that are apophatically unsurpassable. Of this divine cause of all that is, he writes, and you'll recall this from Father William's talk, that it is neither soul nor mind, neither substance nor wisdom, neither being nor unbeing, but simply beyond all assertion and denial. Here again, as with Gregory, one might at first wonder if there's any access at all to this brilliant darkness, to this hidden silence. But a reading of the entire Dionysian corpus shows that this author would answer just as Gregory did. Our access is through love. Indeed, the whole sweep of the Dionysian vision of the universe is one of love. Love going out from God and then drawing everything back to God. As he writes in chapter 4 of the Divine Names, we may be so bold as to claim that the cause of all things loves all things in the superabundance of his goodness. That because of this goodness he makes all things, brings all to perfection, holds all together, and returns all things to himself. In truth, it must be said that the very cause of the universe, in the superabundance of his benign yearning for all, is even carried outside of himself in the loving care that he has for everything. He is, as it were, beguiled by goodness, by love, and by yearning, and is enticed away from his transcendent dwelling place and comes to abide within everything. That is why those possessed of spiritual insight describe him as zealous, because his good yearning for all things is so great, and because he stirs in us a deep yearning desire. Here now is certainly another theological patron of those of you who practice centering prayer. Dionysius' firm conviction that God abides within all things, together with his understanding that it is God's love for us that inspires in a Christian like Paul that exclamation, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me," all this dovetails almost perfectly with a basic component of centering prayer, namely that simple awareness that you are present to God and that this loving God is ever present to you. Words are not a necessary concomitant of that awareness, though at times they might spontaneously break forth in a prayer similar to that beautiful one with which Dionysius begins his mystical theology, when he writes, "O Trinity, higher than any being, any divinity, any goodness, guide of Christians, higher in the wisdom of heaven, lead us up beyond unknowing and light, up to the farthest, highest peak of mystic experience, where the mysteries of God's Word lie simple, absolute, and unchangeable in the brilliant darkness of a hidden silence." Happily, as you know, we now have the complete works of this author available in a good English translation from Paulus Press, while Morehouse Barlow Press in Connecticut has published an excellent introductory study of this mystic written by the British scholar Andrew Louth. And so I hope that what you've read of this mysterious 6th century monk in the anthology will have whetted your appetite to read still more of his works. And now, as I near the end of this first talk, it's time to turn west and move ahead a few centuries to look at the work of a 12th century monk, William of St. Thierry, again, someone of whom we've already heard something from Father Basil. On a superficial level, we could say it's appropriate to say something about William at this institute, at which you have both Benedictine and Cistercian speakers, since William was for 14 years Benedictine abbot at St. Thierry near Reims, and then subsequently a Cistercian monk at the nearby monastery of Signy for another 13 or 14 years before his death in 1148. But on a more substantial level, William is important for the genial way in which he recognized the claims of both knowledge and love, and for the way he harmonized the thought of Eastern authors like Gregory of Nyssa with that of his great Western mentor, Augustine of Hippo. Good English translations of his major works, as well as some important studies of his thought, are available from Cistercian publications in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And if there was one phrase, at least say one Latin phrase, that you might want to carry away from this institute, I suggest that it be William's amor ipse intellectus est. Love itself is a knowing. William's point in saying this is not that there's some strict formal identification between the operations of knowing and loving, but rather that it is only by loving God that we truly come to know God, and that we do so not in a conceptual way, but more after the manner of that affective understanding by which we can be said to know a friend or a work of art. William was not at all anti-intellectual. He writes in his so-called Golden Epistle, addressed to a newly founded community of Carthusian monks, that it is both lawful and possible for us to think and inquire about things that concern God, such as the divine goodness or power. But then, in phrases that remind us of Gregory of Nyssa, William continues, "But what God is in himself his essence, can only be grasped by thought at all insofar as the perception of enlightened love reaches out to it. God's essence exists in a manner that is far more true and excellent than could be grasped by any perception. Yet humble and enlightened love attains to a more certain perception of it than any effort of the reason to grasp it by thought, and it is always better than it could be thought to be. Likewise reminiscent of Gregory is William's insistence that the pinnacle of the Christian life, which he calls unity of spirit with God, is possible only for those who have been purified of anything that obscures the image of God within them, and who consequently are able to will only what God wills. Indeed, for all of these spiritual masters, the only sure criterion that we're on the right path is the way we actually live. Gregory, you'll recall, ended his sermon on the Sixth Beatitude by urging his hearers to avoid not only outwardly vile behavior, but even the thoughts that could provoke such behavior, allowing the divine word, as he puts it, to dig up the evil roots from the depths of our hearts as if by a plow. And Dionysius taught the crucial importance of compassion and forgiveness in a memorable letter he addressed to a monk, Dinophilus, who had apparently rejected someone who had thrown himself at the feet of a priest and sought healing for his evil ways. To this monk, Dionysius remonstrated, "Those who do not know must be taught, not punished. We do not hit the blind, we lead them by the hand. You, however, beat back that man who was beginning to raise his eyes toward the light. Full of goodwill, he came towards you, and how woeful this is, you dared drive him away. By contrast, Christ in his goodness goes to look for the one who is lost in the mountains. He calls after him when he's running away, and as soon as he comes upon him, he takes him on his shoulders." And then closer to our own time, a similar point was made in a beautiful passage in a book that Father Basil co-authored with his friend Sergius Bolshakov, a book entitled In Search of True Wisdom. This is a kind of modern-day version of John Cashin's Conferences, inasmuch as it relates the wisdom of monks that these two authors visited all the way from Mount Athos in the south of Europe to monasteries in the far north, Finland and Norway. Anyway, for persons who are rightly intent on the practice of centering prayer and on teaching others this prayer, it's salutary to recall that prayer is never the be-all and end-all of Christian life, a truth memorably taught in this following passage from Father Basil's book. The monks of a certain community who were full of the thought that by reason of their constant recitation of the Jesus prayer, they were surpassing other monks in virtue, received this word from a spiritual father: "Do not tell me how many times you repeat the prayer. It's something else that interests me. Is there anyone among you, even the most advanced, who can understand the tired humanity of our own day, who can comfort those who suffer? Is there anyone who can free those who have fallen into the snares of the enemy? If there is such a one who can give peace to his brother, who can enable him to come to love life and be thankful to God, that will show me that there are monks among you who have made spiritual progress." And Father Thomas Keating makes the same point in his excellent book, Open Mind, Open Heart, when he writes that you must not judge centering prayer on the basis of how many thoughts come or don't come during the period of prayer. The only way to judge this prayer, he says, it's by its long-range fruits, whether in daily life you enjoy greater peace, humility, and charity. Having come to deep interior silence, you begin to relate to others beyond the superficial aspects of social status, race, nationality, religion, and personal characteristics. In sum, by their fruits you shall know them. On this point, all the spiritual masters whom we've looked at, or will be looking at in my next 3 lectures, are at one with the great master who first spoke those words. May we ever keep them in mind.